All right, we say boot camp, conservative persuasion boot camp. The room's full of conservatives. I think we can take it as an agreed point that persuasion is important if we are to come out on the winning side of Hamilton's challenge, that we govern ourselves by reflection and choice, not accident and force.
I've, since the election, wanted to work on trying to help other conservatives message better. And what I'm really trying hard to do is counter the false narrative that we are obstructionist and extremist.
It's interesting that when I converted, it wasn't because of the loudest voices in my life, or the most logical even. Sometimes it was quiet voices, friends, family, who were able to put forth a compelling counter-narrative that made an emotional and logical appeal to me.
An odd way, or a counterintuitive way, I think the heart of persuasion in many respects is listening. Making sure that you're understanding what, if it's an opponent on, if it's Juan Williams on Fox, if it's somebody I'm in a debate with at a cocktail party with my wife, making sure that whoever it is that I'm ultimately trying to persuade gets the sense, because it's real, that I'm actually listening to what he or she has to say.
If you're talking among conservatives, you think, here's a real clincher argument that no one else has thought of, or here's a factoid that no one else has cited, and you say it, and you're conservative, you're a caller into talk radio, you say it, the talk radio host says, that's great, that's an even better talking point than I had before, and you're both patting each other on the back. There's no evidence, really, that it's actually persuaded anyone out there. And there is a difference between winning an argument and sort of defeating your opponent in a debate and persuading someone.
You can't persuade anybody unless you're making an argument, unless you're actually engaged in the process of trying to persuade. And I think that this is, if I had to cite 3 reasons that Mitt Romney lost, I would put that at or near the top of the list. He didn't make arguments about why the Obama administration had failed. He merely restated his supposition that the Obama administration had failed. But, I think John's point about thinking of political arguments in the same way that you think of marital arguments, and not resisting the temptation to say, I told you so, and actually taking the time to listen to the arguments that people on the other side are making, is incredibly important, even if you reject every single word of the other person's argument.
I think judging people by their own promises is very effective. I mean, that is to say, Obama made certain promises about Obamacare, about the economy, about the world. I mean, wouldn't have gone down the path he went down, but if you look at what he said in the Cairo speech, if you look at what he said about Assad leaving 2 years ago, if you look at his hopes, his outreach to Iran, if you look at a lot of things he said he would do, and we've tested his policies. He's the President of the United States. He had Democratic majorities in both houses for the first 2 years, and has had in the Senate throughout. No one has stopped him, really, from pursuing most of the foreign policies he wanted to pursue. How are they working out? I mean, this is a very good test case in the real world. It's reality that's causing trouble for President Obama, and unfortunately for the rest of us as well, for the country as a whole. It's not, conservative opposition and Republican obstructionism. So I think, again, what Steve did is the right way to go sometimes, to say, let's judge him in his own terms.
If your goal really is to persuade, you don't gain anything, particularly in an interpersonal context, as Bill suggests. You don't gain anything by mocking or invalidating or denigrating. It just doesn't win you the argument. And I often try to, just to cite another quick example, I will try to use arguments, if I'm trying to make a policy argument, I'll try to use arguments that the left likes to use. So when I was talking a decade ago about Iraq and why I thought it was a good thing to go into Iraq, I spent most of my time making arguments that Bill Clinton had made about Saddam Hussein. So I didn't necessarily point to, I just spent very little time actually using sort of George Bush's arguments about the post-9/11 world, or to the extent that I did use those arguments, I said, look, Bill Clinton was right back in 1998 that when he warned about the most dangerous threat we face is a crazy dictator like Saddam Hussein with weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorists. Shouldn't you spend basically what you take in? Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Shouldn't you justify new government programs by going back and looking at the Constitution and the things that are permissible when you're talking about expanding the size and scope of government? These very simple questions are just like the ones that my son asks all of the time. And when I talk to people that way in a
I see some people out there are simply voting in a pretty craven way for free stuff. On the other hand, if you're a liberal, you look at all these rich people voting Republican, people who can afford to come to the Broadmoor and who are Republicans, and you say, oh, they say all these things about how they believe in free markets or they believe in higher principles. But let's face it, it's perfectly obvious Romney was going to cut their taxes and Obama was going to raise them. There's no more to explain. And people believe that. They're not just saying that to annoy everyone in this room. And of course, as a very narrow empirical fact, it is true that if you are wealthy, you arguably would have benefited more from Romney's policies than from Obama's. So I think it's a mistake to look at poorer people, let's say, and say they're just voting for free stuff. And it's also analytically extremely sloppy. I am for cutting government. I am for a more limited government. I am against public sector unions. On the other hand, there are a lot of very decent people who are teachers and nurses and cops and firemen and soldiers and Marines, et cetera, who went into what they went into for very good reasons. They didn't select who would write their paycheck. They didn't select, in some cases, whether they'd be in a right-to-work state or a unionized state. And you can't have the sense of having contempt for the individuals. You have to really say the system isn't set up as well as it could be. But that doesn't mean that the individuals who are teaching school down the road are bad people because they're members, perhaps, of the Colorado Education Association or whatever it's called here, because they don't have much choice probably, or because their paycheck is being written by a government entity. So I think it's very important to distinguish the policy proposals one is from a kind of a contempt for people who happen to be pursuing their livelihoods or living their lives in ways that we would wish the system were set up differently.
The millennials, as we like to call them, it's one of those cases just as a political matter where I think you just pick and choose your arguments. There are going to be arguments that sort of conservatives will make that will be less appealing to that group. We've seen in the polling, for instance, gay marriage arguments. They're not likely to agree with what a lot of conservatives will argue on gay marriage. But if they're not open to broader arguments about fiscal irresponsibility and about the need to pay our bills and about the sort of common sense argument about spending what we have, then nobody is. You want to talk to the millennials about the burdens of student loans. I mean, it probably won't be long where they'll owe more on a per person basis in national debt that may have been spent before them on things that don't affect them than it is on their own education. So that's a group that I think is ripe for picking with the right emphasis and the right arguments.